Welcome, everybody. We'll be starting in a few minutes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ali Farr, and I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement for Owen. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation on device creation and innovation presented by Vanderbilt School of Medicine, the Graduate School, and Owen Forward. I have a few housekeeping items before we get started. There will be time for Q&A at the end, so during the panel, please feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat function to submit any questions that you have for our panelists. Near the end of the hour, I will put a link to a survey in the chat. Please take a few moments after the webinar to complete the survey so we can continue to deliver excellent programming. That is all I have. Thank you again for being here. And now I will let Dean Johnson take it away.
Well, welcome, everybody, and welcome from Nashville. I am the Dean of the Graduate Business School we call it the Owen Graduate School of Management. And I'm sitting in a building that's under construction today. You probably noticed a little bit of fencing over my shoulder because those of you Owen alum and students out there know that we're in a major project going on in the building, but we're going to be opening in the fall for classes, and we're really excited about that. And today I'm here with Dean Andre Christie Mazel, and Andre is a colleague of mine, Dean of the Graduate School and Vice Provost for Graduate Education. And together we're hosting today's panel focused on device innovation. And when you think about medical device creation and innovation, we're thinking about a long road, a device that starts in the lab as a lab idea back in the ideation stage of research and finding its way out to a commercial market is a long and winding road with lots of steps along the way, and one not without risk and peril, getting something to market, but also incredibly important in an area that Vanderbilt has taken a leadership position in, and is doing a lot of work in. And we're really excited to be able to share with you today these panelists' perspective on that process and what that looks like, and some of the things we're doing on campus to facilitate that innovation process. So with that, I want to introduce some of our panelists. First, Dr. Rita Omary is the founder and director of the Medical Innovation Development Program. And that program is a really important part of what happens on campus and in the medical school. Rita is also chaired professor and chair of the Department of Radiology at Vanderbilt Medical Center. And so we're delighted to have him here today. Likewise, Chris Protoss. Chris is the director of global innovation at UCB. And I'll let him tell you a little bit more about what that is when we get into it. But another important part of the chain, the innovation chain, maybe as we would call it. And then Emily Thomas. Emily is a fourth-year medical student, PhD, and is in that Medical Innovators Development Program. So she'll be able to give on-the-ground perspective of what it's like to be part of that program and how that operates and how it impacts the delivery of medical devices. So with that, I'm going to pass it to my co-host, Andre, to kick us off. Andre.
Great. So as we've just heard, the Medical Innovators Development Program trains candidates with PhDs in basic applied sciences and engineering through a 4-year innovation-centered MD curriculum. Dr. Omary, can you talk to us about founding the program and what the process was like?
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to say,
and Reed, as you do that, I want to have you give a little bit of bio of yourself too with that first question. So I jumped over that, and I want to make sure you help tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So it's a real honor to be here, and I very much appreciate the invitation. You know, I'm an interventional radiologist by training, and so think of me as the kid who read a bunch of science fiction and thought about space a lot, and pictured myself floating in space. And it's weird. I still think that way, even though I'm grown up. And what really has inspired me throughout my career is trying to take what is science fiction and make it fact, and convert it into something usable. And so instead of being an astronomer and focused on the heavens, I instead peer inside the body as an interventional radiologist. And throughout my career, I've been very interested in how we can use technology to benefit patients, how to do things that couldn't have been done before, and to create new devices, new programs, new services, new ways to take care of patients. And that's what our program, the Medical Innovators Development Program, is all about. And it's trying to take engineers, applied scientists who have this deep expertise, and try to bring it and link it into medicine, so that we can try to solve problems that we haven't been able to do before using our traditional way of thinking from a biological perspective.
Great. And so would you move on to tell us a little bit about founding the Medical Innovators Development Program and that particular process?
Yeah, and so it is one of the great things about being at Vanderbilt. We're all on one campus, and I love just stepping out of my door in the medical center, which is really in the heart of campus, and you run into people from all the different schools. And so what we have done within the medical school is try and link medicine to both the business school and the engineering school. This concept of thinking of medical innovation as a process that can be taught, and is best taught by bringing expertise that's traditionally outside of medicine. Thinking of the entrepreneurial spirit and all the process of growing businesses that come from the Owen School, and then thinking about how engineers assess problems and go about in an iterative design thinking fashion, trying to solve them.
Great. Emily, as a student in the program, can you tell us a little bit about it and what interested you in becoming a part?
Of course. So I got my PhD originally doing work in synthetic biology. And during that time, I was surrounded by a lot of people that had wacky ideas. Like, for example, one of my mentors, his long-term goal was to grow a spaceship. That was his goal. He wanted to be able to generate bacteria that would be able to create these complex structures and form a spaceship. So I really fell in love with this idea of innovation and taking these like off-the-wall ideas and seeing how far we can get with them. And so when I decided to go to medical school, since I really wanted to have that emphasis of medicine and being able to personally connect with patients and the people I want to help, I knew that I wanted to take that along with me. And MIDP was pretty unique throughout the country. With all the medical schools I looked at, it was the only one with a program like this. While other schools had programs for PhDs, they're generally focused on shortening the medical curriculum to 3 years rather than 4 years, so less training rather than more training and innovation. So that's what really drew me to this program.
Great. Thank you.
Well, that's neat. Well, Chris, I'm coming to you next with a question, but before I do that, tell us a little bit about UCB and your role there.
Sure, absolutely, Dean Johnson. And yeah, so glad to be here tonight with everybody. So my name is Chris Protoss, and I work for UCB. We are a global biopharmaceutical company based in Brussels, Belgium. I'm not there; it'd be the middle of the night. I'm here in Atlanta. But if you ever do need recommendations for a good place to find some French fries, chocolate, or beer, I am definitely your guy. I can tell you how to find some places in Brussels. But UCB, we're a mid-size biopharma company. That means that we don't necessarily have the unlimited budgets to compete with the likes of Pfizer and J&J and some of the big players around the world. And so what we decided is a strategic shift is for us to put patients at the heart of everything we do. And our competitive advantage, our strategic goal was to be that patient-preferred biopharma leader. And what that mean was really trying to revamp the way that not only we delivered medicines, innovative new medicines to our patient populations, but also in the way that we supported those patients across their entire patient journey. And that's where my role really does fit in my innovation role of being able to really understand what are the unique challenges that each population is facing, and then design new interventions. Like Reed was saying, right? These might be products, they might be services, they might be experience or devices to support those patients along their journey and drive better outcomes. So yeah, that is my role. And one of the big tools that we use is design thinking. And that is, as we will talk a lot about tonight, is a core methodology to help us do just that, put those patients in the center of our development process and produce and validate and deploy ultimately these new tools that'll help them along their journey.
And Chris, we think about that design thinking, that problem solving methodology is an iterative process. Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Yeah.
What does it mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It is for me, and there are many flavors of design thinking. So we won't get hung up on the nuances of the details here. I was trained at our friends out on the West Coast in Stanford. And so they take a certain approach to it all. But at the core of all of the design methodology is 3 parts, really. The first part being empathy and understanding that human needs, so really getting to know the people for whom you are trying to build a solution. The second part of that is around creativity and the way, and I love some of these discussions here about growing a spaceship from bacteria and floating in space, right? That is that sort of disassociative thinking, that creativity that we need to bring into our design process to develop new solutions. And that really plays a big part in pharmaceutical development. We are classically trained scientists. We follow the scientific method, and that's about testing, developing hypotheses and testing those. But those often go along, right, what historically has been the precedent. So we try to shake things up a little bit and bring new inputs into that design process. And then the third part of the design process is around, like you said, iteration. And this is oftentimes the biggest challenge that we face as an industry, is that iteration, that the drug delivery and development life cycle takes so long, right? Several years, going through different phases, right? Phase 1, 2, and 3, and ultimately deploying a medicine. And failure is not really tolerated in that, right? You fail, and that's a multi-million-dollar loss to the company. In the design process, though, you can iterate and you can start to mitigate some of that risk, whether it's in drug discovery or it's actually in these non-drug solutions that I find most of my time working on. So as we iterate, we develop prototypes, we get them into the world to our users' hands, we have them validate whether it works or not and feed that back in. Through that, we can start to shorten that development life cycle, and we're ready to launch an actual product into the world. We have a better sense that this is actually going to meet a need and deliver the outcomes we intended to.
But it still sounds like a long process. What would be typical in your experience for the kinds of innovations that you're working on?
Yeah, it is. And I used to get frustrated by that. The long cycles, it can last anywhere, at least in the non-drug space, right? Innovation cycles can be anywhere from 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, maybe even longer. Now, where I used to be frustrated, right, with that lack of speed, I've come to write. I've made peace within the sense that our industry is one that is grounded by safety and efficacy, right? I've made peace with it because we want to make sure that our products do the things we say they will do, and that they won't harm anybody. And that applies for medicines first and foremost, but it applies to the devices and apps and other services that we provide. And so we talk about 18 months. Well, that might not be as fast as a Google or Facebook pushing out a new feature onto their platform, but it's something that I think should take some pride in as an industry. No fake news right here. We want to make sure that we have solid evidence that our new solutions will work. But to your point, right, the iteration does help us when we get to the end of those 18 months, for example. We know that something, or at least have a better sense that something will work rather than going back to the beginning of the drawing board, similar to, say, an agile methodology versus a waterfall methodology, if we know a little bit about like the software development process as well.
So Dr. Omary, how does that look like back on the teaching side when you're in the medical device innovation program? How do you go about teaching that kind of a design process in the curriculum?
Yeah, and so I think Chris at the very beginning touched on there's many perspectives on design thinking, and so there's no one way of doing it. I think what we try to get across to our learners, and I include faculty within our learners, because we're all learning together. This mindset of recognizing we need to start with empathy. So what is the real problem we're trying to solve? And if we can spend time, actually a lot of time, trying to define that, what is the real need of a patient or a group of patients? Because sometimes we may shoot from the hip and think we know what it is. Having a great solution to the wrong problem doesn't actually help it. And thinking about time, Chris, 18 months to turn something around in 18 months and actually solve the real problem that needs to be solved. That's amazing, because how many of us in our lives, whether it's at school or at work or at home, we go down the road and we're just doing the wrong thing from the beginning, and we keep adding to it, and we get to the end and realize, oh wow, we just wasted all of that time. So I think spending the time asking a lot of questions and seeking the input of people with many perspectives, like you can find on the Vanderbilt campus, I think is one of the critical hallmarks. Whether or not we can sit down at a board and say, at what stage are we at within the process? And then I think the fun part, who doesn't like to come up with ideas? And so being inclusive, soliciting those ideas, and recognizing that where we are in the cycle, are we soliciting the ideas, or are we diverging, or are we converging on trying to focus on a few of those ideas? And so getting us into this concept of let's kind of work through this, and let's test that. Let's realize almost certainly whatever we do in the beginning is not going to work. It's not going. It's like for any of us here who've had the joy of writing essays or personal statements for our admissions to university and school and graduate schools, that first draft is generally awful. if we're doing it right, it's just awful. But we got to feel comfortable. It's going to be like 7 drafts before we're anywhere near where we want to show this to somebody else to get their feedback. And so that's what we try to instill with our learners on the medical front, and to realize that we're all in this together. We're going to seek lots of input, and we're going to work all these iterations through as part of the process.
So then,
and if I might even give no, I apologize there. It's
please.
I was going to just give a good example of this, as a real world example of this iteration of just. I always find being on these panels, sharing my failures is always a lot more instructive than sharing my successes. But where the iteration comes into play is we were building a clinical decision support tool for neurologists. Using some kind of AI on the back end that helped predict the most efficacious medicine for a certain patient type. And we built this, the UI, the user interface, in a way that presupposed one way that neurologists would use the tool. We built a prototype and we gave it to them, and they hated it, absolutely hated it. And the reason they hated it was that they felt like the machine, this user interface, this software that sat on top of the AI, took away their decision-making authority, and took away, more than that, their problem-solving ability. Neurologists, by and large, are problem solvers. They work this magic in this kind of weird thing we call a brain. And so that was something that said, we're not going to use this thing. But we hadn't spent much effort and time. We built a prototype. It was pretty, but you could click the buttons, but it didn't go anywhere. And we took that feedback back to the drawing board and totally revamped how we were going to deploy this new solution. And then we were off to the races, right? But that prototype right there, that iteration, helped save us probably a year in development if we would have taken that initial solution to market.
So, backing up a moment, I think one of the things we often talk about is some kind of creative idea this whole thing starts with. And as both of you have been saying, sometimes that creative idea can take you in the wrong direction, but you need a start. You need some kind of spark. In Nashville, we often, talk about the music industry, and, the much repeated refrain is that it all starts with a song. And one of the things that Nashville really prides itself is we have this kind of critical mass of songwriters here that just continues to kind of grow and bubble along. And many predict, will be, in some sense, Nashville's secret sauce for years and years and years to come, because it's an affordable, interesting place to live, where creative types can come and create songs. But that even saying that, as soon as you take that back across the street to the Owen School, we start trying to imagine, can we somehow teach this creativity? And one of my faculty members, some of you probably interacted with, is a fellow named Professor David Owens. He now is on my faculty, but also directs the Wondery, and has a book, something like Creative People Must Be Stopped, or something like that. And of course has taught courses around creativity here for years, but not without skeptics. Many people wonder, is creativity really something that you can teach? And of course, in the business school context, just like in the medical school context, there's a place for it, right? Do we really want creative accountants? Well, maybe not. Do we want the ones that, keep us out of jail or keep the IRS off our back or whatever it is? But all that said, I guess a long lead up, Dr. Omary, to ask you, can creativity be taught from your perspective when you think about this program? Can creativity be taught?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, all of us as kids were creative. You think about, I've got three kids, and my youngest are still, they just finished 3rd grade, and watching them play, watching their imagination and how they think about things. And the thing about preparing our kids for the rigors of college is we have to teach them to essentially sit down in high school for 6 hours straight and just just take in the information from the teacher. And part the unintended consequence of that is I think we often beat out the native creativity that I think is in like all children. And so I think the answer is we have to often relearn how to be creative, and how do we get back to that playful child like nature, and where do we go for ideas, what time of day. I think if we can become reflective, like for me, it's clearly first thing in the morning. It's going out for a walk, it's going for a swim, or it's taking a shower, like those like. And if I'm trying to solve something, I'm going to have a much better shot at the front of the day than if, like, at 9 o'clock at night, I have zero creativity then. So for all of us, anyone here on this webinar, the opportunity to examine ourselves and ask, what's the best time of day for us to get ideas? Where can we go to interact with people who think differently with us? And if like on the Vandy campus, I'm a physician. If I go and I interact with an anthropologist, we're gonna come to a different way, a different place than if one of us tried to solve a problem alone. So I think definitely it's something that we can help catalyze.
Certainly in my world on the business school side, we talk a lot about that with entrepreneurship, and kind of one of the major beliefs around entrepreneurship is around failure, in the sense of being willing to fail. Maybe that gets to the childlike piece that you were talking about, that there's not this fear of failure or kind of embarrassment or whatever else that might come with that, right? And certainly on the entrepreneurship side, I mean, we run a lot of entrepreneurial programming and courses and so forth. And it's almost reached this point like an AA meeting when you get a bunch of people together. They all start out, hi, my name is Eric Johnson, and here's how I failed today. And that's like a badge of courage, as it were, right? Rather than a failure in terms of maybe addiction or something like that, but really something that if you don't have a failure story, you're not a card-carrying entrepreneur, and you'll never will be, kind of thing, right? But does that same feeling stem across your world, Reed or Chris, that feeling of failure or the ability to fail?
Chris, why don't you answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the big cultural norms that I try to change here at UCB. As a biopharma company, right, failure's not great, right? When we fail a drug trial, not only is that a financial challenge, but it is something where years and years and years, add-on years of our bench scientists and the patients that we've tried to help, right? That's a failure to be able to make a difference in somebody's life. So failure is not something that is really looked favorably upon. And that is absolutely true, right? We should try to get better at drug trials so we don't fail those. The cultural shift, though, is moving the mindset away from innovation as not only drug discovery, but as also these types of supportive services, products, interventions, apps, devices that we can implement and really change health outcomes for the better. And so that's the cultural norm we try to overcome here. And that's where the design comes into it, our iteration, our prototyping, our agile models. All of these things we try to put in place to overcome that training and that bias so that we make it okay for people to fail. In fact, one of the things that we do, we do run an agile model here on our teams, and we run in sprints to develop our new products and services. And we do a retro at the end of every one of our sprints. And a big part of those retros are to debrief, right? What went well, what didn't go well. And there's a badge of courage of actually sharing those failure stories there that we're trying to instill that it's okay. Tell those stories, we can all learn from it and get better in the future.
I have a question sort of linking our conversation about failure and creativity. I think of many of the very beginning graduate students that I'm working with, and they want to change everything. So we're developing an instrument for depression or a survey instrument, and they say, well, let's throw out all the old questions and let's start here. Well, having done this for 25 years, I know that there are elements of depression as we see it clinically, and we have to have some of these. So what's the balance between, what are the benchmarks in this iterative process that you put in place to assure, for lack of a better phrase, that we're not too creative or that we're not too relying on the old methods? I mean, I imagine the team that Dr. Omary mentioned, the MD getting together with the anthropologist, that sort of helps. So the team can play an important part. But just sort of in the process overall, how do you balance those two things? You can't fail at everything, but you can't brainstorm creatively forever either.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that, for me, or who would like to pick that up? I certainly have a point of view, but I'd love to let Dr. Omary or Emily kind of jump in here on some of these as well.
Yeah. So Emily, do you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I think it's something that we all kind of balance every day. Like, we're not going to go drive a new way to work every day to try and find the optimum path. We kind of find our routine, but we may try cooking slightly different every day. It kind of depends on time constraints, and also as a student, I feel like oftentimes we have very creative ideas that aren't always helpful to the main team, and so that it's very helpful to have mentors that can kind of direct us appropriately to be like, okay, this is the expectations of, let's think about this. This is your little box that you can work within to be creative as like baby steps trading towards something that has room for innovation, and that would be helpful to have a new perspective on it. While we may know that this other part of it that you may be questioning right now has worked very well and it's actually been through several rounds of innovation, so you don't need to necessarily waste your time thinking about that. You already drove your car to work hundreds of times. You don't need to like try a different way today.
Yeah, and I'd like to amplify Dr. Thomas's points there, and think of it as a combination. All of us in the classic sense, we're a blend of the analytical left brain with the more creative right brain, and I think viewing it as an and. We want to instill the creativity, and we have to have the rigor and the discipline to ask ourselves, what does success look like? Let's define that. And we may not want to get too much like the accountants, though, and that's the only thing we're looking. So we want to be open to that blend and recognize what's there and what we can use, and what can we what might we create differently, or what might we link together that already exists in a different way, because that's certainly that's the classic Apple model for innovation.
Thank you. Chris, you said you had a perspective too.
Yeah, it's and thank you for the kind of allowing me to jump in. I think this is a really critical part that we don't talk a lot about. And from my perspective, right, oftentimes I get the question of like, what are our KPIs, right? What are our outcome measures? And in the biosciences, pharma, right, there's certain ones that are the go-tos, right? It's medication adherence, or in the world of epilepsy, right, is seizure occurrence. These are the standards. But these are outcome measures that are kind of broad-based and well accepted, right? These are the let's call it the accountant KPIs for the products. But there is also, I think, a very important set of patient measures, right? If we really put patients at the heart of everything we do, we need to co-create with our end users and develop KPIs and outcome measures that are important to them. As an example of that, right, we were working in the Parkinson's space. You know, it's a neurodegenerative disease with tremors is one of the symptoms. And oftentimes, right, the key KPI is on and off states in Parkinson's. And that's really important from a clinical perspective. But it doesn't often resonate with that patient population. And so we developed an outcome measure for an app we developed for them that was framed in things that they could no longer do or wanted to do more of. So as an example, right, if they were someone who took a walk with their dog in the morning, the outcome measure was being able to take more walks with their dogs. If they wanted to be able to put away their dishes after they washed them and weren't afraid to kind of reach up into a high shelf and put those away, that became an outcome measure for this app. And that was really kind of eye-opening, because not only did it change the way we measure the outcomes, it changed the way we designed for the solution as well. Just kind of bringing that patient perspective, those co-created outcome measures into the process really changed the way we designed the tool.
Well, it sounds like certainly as we kind of think through that whole creativity discussion we were just having, that that there's maybe a timing question along the way, right? And I think, Chris, you were making that point earlier on when you were talking about kind of beyond the pill solutions, the things you were doing, that certainly in the pharma process, late in the process is not a great time to experience failure. And so you want to have that creativity happen early, and as you kind of drive down that funnel, put more and more process around it, and to Andre's point, have some guardrails around things, so that there isn't a lot of kind of crazy creativity going on when you get down to trials, because the last thing we want is creative statistics around the trials, right? We want science that we believe in and certainly understand well. But there may be places early on where creativity should be highly encouraged and facilitated in that way. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, Andre, I'll pass it back to you to talk to Emily about her program.
Yeah. So Emily, I'm just wondering if you could just kind of tell us a little bit more about your experience with innovation in the program. How does it happen for you?
I think we've gotten a lot of great instructions that we kind of talked about a little bit of framing our mind appropriately for creativity and relearning how to kind of think like a kid. I think one of the techniques we were taught is to just use all of our senses when we're entering a new situation. We often have the fresh eyes as medical students where we're entering the OR for the first time or taking a patient's blood pressure for the first time. It's all kind of new, and by being able to observe it from a lot of different perspectives can kind of allow us to think broadly about kind of what problems patients are experiencing, medical providers are experiencing, other personnel within the hospital are experiencing. And from there, once we identify the problem, allows us to then think creatively about solutions. We have less of the guardrails that sometimes happens as we get into the routine of just like, this is how we do it. This is just how I've been doing it for 20 years. So it kind of helps that, allows us to think a little bit more creatively. It's like every step is a small funnel where it's like, okay, what within all of medicine would I want to change? It's like, okay, let me think about surgeons getting overheated in the OR. That seems like a problem. And then you can narrow in on that and be like, okay, how can we think about lowering the body temperature of surgeons so they don't get overheated? We could think about like personal cooling, maybe change the room or something. And that allows us to kind of move stepwise towards a potential solution. It really helps to have my classmates as well, since they're great to bounce ideas off of. That way we can kind of take our own kind of unique perspectives along with the people we interview that are experiencing it every day to kind of go more towards a solution.
So for someone like me who's not engaged in this every day, can you tell me, maybe using one of the examples you just pointed out, that the surgeon's overheating. So you have that idea, you've been trained to sort of assess your environment and think creatively about what could be different. What happens next?
So we've been part of this great thing called Idea Lab. So the project we actually started to move forward with is this big problem of hospital readmissions. And so we identified that it would be helpful to have an algorithm to predict which patients are more likely to be readmitted. And so during this Idea Lab course, we were able to iterate on that, create a prototype, and then at the end of the course, we were facilitated to help start talking with people at Vanderbilt as well as start commercially exploring it. So we were able to start a C Corp, do a few pitch competitions. We're now applying to NSF I-Corps. So thankfully the MIDP team has been very supportive of us throughout this process. Since when I came in, I didn't really have a lot of entrepreneurship knowledge, but they were able to support us through that of going from idea to like product generation to then exploring the market for it.
So one of the things I was impressed with your answer is you sort of said, maybe you see this or this or this. So you reeled off 3, 4, 5, 6 things. In the academy, it's often been important for us to have an area of expertise. And so I'm just wondering, is it the idea that you're drawn most toward? How do you go about figuring out where you want to make your home in terms of expertise?
I think that was really difficult for our cohort. We wanted to work on a project together, and we have a biochemist, we have a materials engineer, and we had a nuclear engineer. So very different kind of expertise fields and interests. But we had all had patients that experienced bad outcomes because they keep getting readmitted to the hospital. And then Adam, one of my colleagues, had extensive training in machine learning and creating algorithms. So we thought that we may use his skills towards that end. So it's kind of a combination of personal interest and then what skills you personally have and what skills your friend group or colleagues have.
Great, thank you. Great answer. Chris, if you don't mind, I'd like to move back over to you to talk a little bit more about the patient perspective. You gave a great example of what people with Parkinson's actually wanted in the app. Can you talk a little bit more about that process? How do you know that you've accomplished getting the perspective of the patient and that you've actually used it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that's at the core of what we try to do. And eventually I can give another example of how we go about doing that. One of the projects that I'm working on right now is collaboration with the University of Washington School of Pharmacy, and we're developing new interventions for people living with epilepsy with their community pharmacist. And when we started that project, we kind of started very clinically. We started kind of bringing in some of the validated tools and the best practices and the off-the-shelf solutions that might help us out there. But where it didn't quite fulfill the needs of our patients is that we didn't bring those patients into the development process. And so when we started to do that, we really started to understand what the real patient need was. And you know, I host a lot of these discussions. I find it much more valuable to be outside of the office and inside of, say, a patient's home, or in the case of COVID, over Zoom like this, and having these conversations. But what we really found when we spoke to people living with epilepsy was they just had a lot of questions that pharmacists were well suited to answer. If you've ever taken a prescription medication, you've probably gotten these package inserts, and every single time a patient described it, she would open up and make this thing, you know, that foldy thing, and they would make this big sort of hand gesture. I'm like, oh, I know exactly what you're talking about. You know, the thing that's like 800 pages long, folded into like a 1 square inch piece of paper. It's like, yes, exactly that. And it was through those types of conversations that you really start to understand what those real needs are, right? I think Dr. Thomas, Dr. Omary have talked a lot about, right, that problem. And this is what this problem seeking is all about, is having those conversations with the people you are trying to serve to build a solution for, in this case, right, people living with epilepsy. And so we took that insight amongst many others, and it helped us really start to build our intervention. And And to your question specifically about how we're using it, how do we know? Well, with that solution, right, we're going to study it, right? We're going to study it in a interventional type of study, measure it, develop these specific outcome measures that will help us really get to that real patient need. And so I think it's a bit of a hybrid, right? To our kind of theme of tonight, there's this structure that I think we need to develop to be able to develop outcome measures so that we have the data to make sure that the things that we develop work the way we say they're going to work. And then there's the creativity part of it, of bringing in these sort of disassociative thinkings and putting them through this rigorous design process to be able to come up with these great solutions about how we can kind of bring new ideas into this healthcare world. So I think that would be my answer around that. It's kind of that combination of all. It's collaboration across disciplines. It's a collaboration across perspectives. It is that kind of recognition, if we want to be vulnerable for a second, that like we don't have the answers to everything, and only by actually these types of, like tonight's panel, or collaborating across Vandy, or collaborating across the healthcare ecosystem, can really start to deliver new solutions that help our patient populations, right, achieve the outcomes they want, live the lives that they want to lead.
Thank you very much. Dean Johnson.
Yeah, that's great. You can really see that theme coming through, that kind of voice of the customer and collaboration, bringing lots of other people into the process. And finding ways to teach that has always been something that I think Vanderbilt really prides itself in. One of the programs that we've been working on the last couple of years here is one called Innovation Realization, where we take someone from the PhD side that's been working hard on a great idea and getting all that kind of feedback from their colleagues and so forth in a lab, but then matching them up with some MBA students, some JD students, throwing them together for a year, very different perspectives, right?
Yeah.
But at that point, taking that next step to see, is this commercializable? Is there a way to kind of really take this and build some business, or somehow realize the innovation that's there? And it's just one of many ways that we work on campus to do that. Emily, I just want to come back to you because we're coming towards the end, and incidentally, I want to point out to our listeners that if you have a question, now's a great time to throw it in to the chat or to the QA function, and we'll pick them up at the end. But Emily, as you think about the future, what trends really inspire you?
I think a lot of the great trends that I've seen is that a lot of times we think of technology as kind of ethically neutral. We're just kind of creating new things, and that we're now thinking more about the implementation of what happens when we take this technology and apply it to the real world setting, where oftentimes we don't apply this technology equitably, and so it can reinforce existing healthcare disparities or other disparities that we have within our society. So I really think, especially in the algorithm space, a lot of people are thinking more about what happens when we use these algorithms, what happens when we use this technology, and how can we make it so that these technologies, these innovations, help everyone and equitably within our world, and don't just help one certain segment of the population.
Yeah, and avoid some sort of unintended consequences that you might not have foreseen. That's great.
So I'd like to ask Chris and Dr. Omary. Dr. Thomas, I wouldn't mind having your opinion too here. How has the COVID crisis, affected your approach to innovation?
Chris, you want to lead off with that?
Yeah, that's it has, and as I said earlier, I love being in the living room of the people we're trying to build solutions for. It's really hard to be in the living room right when COVID is raging. And so what we had to pivot towards was a more remote model. And I think this is one of the silver linings as well, where we were able to actually engage and reach out to different patient populations through technology like this, right, Zoom and whatnot. it doesn't change the way, at least the intent. We are still really trying to understand how the lived experience plays itself out. And in some cases, right, the technology that we use over COVID actually helped us to do that better. When we were doing a more ethnographic style observation, a simple like diary app really can be an amazing tool. We were doing some work at different points of care that pharmaceutical companies typically don't go into, right? Places like Disney. How might we develop better solutions for a person living with epilepsy visiting Disney World or flying on an airplane? And as fun as it would be to go to Disney to do that research, we used a tool that allowed EMTs in these spaces to be able to document their day, take pictures, put together a little bit of a diary of what they were experiencing. And that was a phenomenally useful tool to be able to do this sort of remote ethnography, if that's a contradiction in terms a little bit. Some of my anthropology friends would probably hold me to task about that. But as a way to gather some of these observations, it's really a useful tool. And I'm really happy that COVID at least gave us opportunity to explore and try new of those things. I'm sure we'll certainly put that in our tool belt going forward as well.
And
That's neat.
you know, I think all of us have our COVID stories, personal, family, you know, where we work, and I think for me the biggest lesson of COVID is fundamentally in thinking about what innovation is about others adopting your solution. And if we look back, I think what COVID has taught us is if we don't have that mindset from the beginning, we'll fail. And I'm going to pull out, you know, the mask. We absolutely failed as a society in getting these adopted. We failed, and we failed because we didn't view it as an innovation problem. It's just a lump of cloth or whatever. But this is a technology. This is new to Americans, and if we treated it as an innovation problem, we would have started getting back to Chris's point in the empathy, understanding the needs of others. We wouldn't have said the data speak for themselves. Like the data never speak for them. So like nobody responds to, and then berating people for not wear, like that's not a way to get more people to wear masks. So I think the great learn from COVID is to we have to, if we're going to get others to want to adopt something, we really need to understand what it takes to get them to want to use a product, want to use a service. And, you know, with COVID, it was, you know, one step more difficult with that because we had people actively undermining wanting this. So, many lessons for us. I cannot wait to see how many dissertations we'll have written in the future about this.
That's great. That's great. Hey, we've got a question from one of our listeners. Lynn wants to know if you see value or use kind of the hackathon competitions that are so popular in a lot of the entrepreneurial space. Are they as popular in the life sciences space to incentivize collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, I can take a shot at this. So here at UCB, we ran a hackathon a few years ago to develop new solutions for people living with epilepsy. Yeah, and it was a very successful effort for us. What I think kind of the pros and the cons of hackathons is that the selection of who comes and the recruiting of who comes, I think, is really important. If I want to get to like the nuts and bolts of how it goes together. Because I think as Dr. Thomas was talking too, it's like having that sort of collision of great minds like y'all have at MIDP is really important. If you don't recruit the right people to a hackathon, if you just have potentially a lot of the same sort of backgrounds coming, you're going to get a lot of the same ideas coming out of it. So I think kind of that recruiting is really, really important going into a hackathon. And I think the second lesson learned around a hackathon for me is just the where on this sort of innovation maturity curve many of the ideas are. And oftentimes they are relatively nascent, right? Kind of these sort of, if you're in the startup world, right? These are like, you wouldn't even like angel invest in them. These are like pre-revenue ideas in that sense. And as such, right, you have to nurture them a little bit and have a plan ready to go post-hackathon to be able to nurture these ideas so you can grow them from a little bit of a seed into a plant and they can bear some fruit down the road. And that was one of my lessons learned from my hackathons. We didn't do that very well. Again, sharing some of our failures versus successes. But on the positive side, right, the energy that these hackathons bring are really amazing. And I think that's something that is inspiring, not only for the people that are in the hackathon, but as we share that story widely across at least our organization and beyond, the ideas and sparks that those folks in the hackathon generated across our teams was worth the price of admission for that effort. Yeah, so I think they're amazing. I think there's just probably some kind of logistical or kind of guardrail things coming in and coming out that are kind of pre and post the hackathon itself to make these things successful.
Thank you. In the question and answer, John asked, he's wondering how he could share or someone could share a passionate, in quotes, medical idea with members of this group. So if there were creative ideas to share with one of you, how could he contact you?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think does our bios or my bio at least in the, it was going, yeah, please feel free to reach out to me. Always interested in hearing a great idea that might be able to help our patient populations.
Thank you.
Great. Well, we're about ready to wrap up the evening, but I'll give you a last bite at this, Reed. What do you see in the future? 60 seconds. Tell us about the future.
I see one of the other great outcomes of COVID is recognizing that no one entity, no one group, no one organization is able to solve the most difficult challenges. We have to do it together, whether that's in academia, whether that's in industry, government, nonprofits. We're all part of this giant world, and we learned that if we can do some great stuff together.
That's awesome. Well, Reed, Chris, Emily, Andre, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us this evening. And thank you all for joining, part of Vanderbilt's lifelong alumni outreach. And one of the things that we really are excited about, maybe a learning from COVID, as it were, ability to bring the Vanderbilt community out to the alum and the greater world with some great ideas. And I think we heard a lot of really interesting ideas this evening. So thank you all for joining us. This session is recorded and will be available. So feel free to check back and pass it along. And as you saw in the chat, we would be delighted to hear any comments you have. So please take a short survey and tell us what you thought of this evening's session. But thank you all, and all the best from Vanderbilt to you.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.